Analog horror versus the Doomslayer from Doom the Dark Ages is not even close. In this video, I will explain just how this earlier version of the Slayer from the newest game, Doom the Dark Ages, can solo pretty much all of analog horror, even though he was nerfed. For this video, I will compare a few select analog horrors from past videos, as well as some new ones in order to prove my point. So let's begin first with the Slayer. Doom the Dark Ages, being a prequel to Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, takes place when Doom Guy just got his divine powers from Samuel Hayden. This version of the Slayer differs to that of the other games by being a more medieval themed and also a bit weaker. But how much weaker? Well, for one, he just got his god powers. Since Doom Guy before this was pretty much a mortal, the new god powers he got might take a little time to figure out. 2. Since the Doomslayer gets powered up every time he kills a foe, it would be safe to assume that since this version of Doom Guy has yet to fight as many enemies and demons as the Doomslayer from Eternal and Doom 2016, he would be weaker. It is also shown that the Slayer can get damaged, which was surprising considering they stated that the Doomslayer should be invulnerable to damage. But now moving on to the analog horror section, let's first quickly look at some analog horrors that I've yet to talk about, starting with Nuclear Nightmare. This analog horror is pretty much a radioactive fungus that infects and mutates people to become lanky, tall, humanoid radioactive creatures that believe they are the next step beyond humans. They number in the millions and have wiped out a large portion of the population as well. There's also a large celestial creature, name of Earth Last Stand, which is larger than the Earth. When comparing them to the medieval Slayer, he could easily destroy the uranium fungus infected people. These creatures, apart from being radioactive with some other minor abilities, are pretty much your usual humanoid analog horror monster that would lose against an imp. But Earth's Last Stand is where the analog horror gets interesting, because of its large size which towers over most titans. This planet-level plus being would make for a good fight against the medieval Slayer, but ultimately it would likely lose just cause the Slayer is still the same guy which killed the Colossal Hell's champion with his bare hands, even though he still does get overpowered by the Hell Prince in the game cutscenes. Next up to the chopping block is analog horror Batman. This Batman from this analog horror series is pretty much your usual Batman with all of his strength, intelligence, abilities, experience, and tools, but just a bit emaciated and deranged. Now, from the video and from what I've gathered from a few explanation videos that I've watched regarding the analog horror Batman, there is no real supernatural or anomalous abilities present for this horror Batman, at least not in that much of a substantial way. But how would this Batman fare against the medieval Slayer? Well, this mostly boils down to if prep time will actually help horror Batman. With prep time, normal Batman can fight and win against many very strong, almost godlike beings, but they have to have a weakness. The Doomslayer is practically no weakness, no matter which version of him you choose. The only way to beat him is by just being strong enough to throw hands with him or actually overpower him, which horror Batman or even normal Batman couldn't. Local 58, an old analog horror series that I've put off including because of how abstract and mysterious it is, which makes getting a reasonable scale as to what the entities in this analog horror are capable of quite difficult. But pretty much the moon and other mysterious creatures of unknown origin are on Earth attacking people. Some of the creatures in this analog horror, like the ones from this video and from the newer videos, are somewhat strong creatures with mind control, illusion making, and other telepathic abilities. Because little is revealed about the actual physical makeup of these creatures, I will say for this video that these creatures are about on par, if not a little stronger than your average analog horror monster. Now, the moon, which is either its own entity or has a entity living on it or inside of it, is about, well, moon level, cause it's a moon. So can the creepy critters from Local 58 challenge the medieval Slayer? Well, not really. Each entity that is on Earth terrorizing people are no more powerful than low-level demons from Doom games, which is a pretty common theme when looking at the grand majority of analog horror, with the only exception in this series being the moon or moon creature living on the moon. Now, the moon still loses to the medieval slayer, but it provides a more substantial challenge than any other local 58 creatures. Now for the final section of the video. Let's see if some of the stronger analog horrors from past Doom Guy videos are of any challenge to the medieval slayer. We got arguably the strongest analog horror series, which is Monument Mythos. For this one, only 3 characters are important to consider in this situation. Everybody else is strong, don't get me wrong, but not strong enough for the Slayer. Now, these 3 are the Crescent King, Nixon, and the Horned Serpent, or Wonderland. But you can also call the Horned Serpent George Washington, because it's George Washington. Now, starting off with the Crescent King, which is by far the weakest of these 3, the only reason why it poses any challenge for the Slayer to fight is because of its mimetic immortality, which the Slayer would have trouble dealing with, primarily because he would not want to terminate millions of innocent people just to beat the Crescent King, which would then make this situation more of a stalemate. For the second strongest of the Monument Mythos series, which is Nixon, this would be much more of a challenge for the Slayer because of Nixon's ability to change reality and also fictionalize it. Now, could this much weaker version of the Slayer still win? Well, since an earlier version of the Slayer before Godhood was able to defeat the Icon of Sin, which is quite similar in the reality warping abilities department as Nixon, the medieval Slayer should technically win. And if you consider the hacks of, a bunch of willpower and being able to pretty much just ignore most things, then yeah, the Slayer should take this one. But what about the arguably strongest analog horror entity as a whole, George Washington? This being is very powerful in that it can range from Universe Plus to even up to a multiversal level. But who would win between the Horned Serpent and the Slayer? Well, the winner between these 2 is the medieval Slayer, but just barely. Let me explain. This is because the Slayer fights in Doom's Hell, which is beyond space, time, and dimension. This Hell, which in Doom is its own entity and quite a powerful one at that, is also able to change space, time, and dimensions within itself, which affects everybody indiscriminately. Since the Slayer is able to exist there just fine, this would allow him to resist any time or space tomfoolery from George Washington. But if you consider his willpower hacks, which, just ignores pretty much mostly everything, then the Doomslayer is actually impervious to space-time and dimension-related attacks and abilities, for the most part. So, in conclusion, analog horror versus the Doomslayer is not even close.